There was always something magnetic about Tony Curtis. The charm, the wit, the easy smile that made audiences believe he lived a golden life untouched by darkness. But behind that polished exterior was a man shaped by wounds he never fully escaped, scars carved long before fame ever touched him. The world loved him as a Hollywood icon, yet few understood the private storms he carried, the secrets that followed him from childhood into the final years of his life. And once those truths finally surfaced, they revealed a version of Tony Curtis no one was prepared to see. The childhood that turned a boy into a survivor. Tony Curtis began life not as a Hollywood star, but as Bernard Schwartz, a child born in 1925 to Hungarian Jewish immigrants who struggled to survive in the back room of a tailor shop in New York City. The world he entered was not gentle. Poverty was constant, food was scarce, and English was a language he did not understand. His parents, exhausted and overwhelmed, simply could not provide, and by the age of 8, Tony and his younger brother Julius were placed in an orphanage, not because they were unwanted, but because the family couldn't afford to feed them. That kind of abandonment leaves a mark no spotlight can erase. When Tony returned home, tragedy followed him. 4 years later, Julius, his closest companion, was struck and killed by a truck. Tony was only 12, yet already carrying a burden of grief that would shape the rest of his life. And the storm didn't end there. Tony's mother suffered from schizophrenia, sometimes violent, always unpredictable. Later, his surviving brother Robert would develop the same illness and be institutionalized. Home was never safe, never steady, never warm. It was a place where survival depended on silence, endurance, and emotional walls that hardened long before he ever saw a movie camera. Feeling lost and angry, Tony joined a street gang. Their crimes were small, truancy, petty theft, but for a boy with no guidance, it felt like the only path forward. Then one neighbor, someone who saw more in him than trouble, sent him to Boy Scout camp. That decision changed everything. Away from chaos, Tony discovered discipline, structure, and a glimpse of who he might become if he refused the darkness waiting for him back home. By the time he returned to school, something inside him had shifted. At 16, he stepped on stage for the very first time, shaving his head bald for a role he took more seriously than anyone expected. In that moment, the broken boy from the Bronx found a spark of purpose. Acting wasn't just a dream, it was an escape, a ladder out of the life he had been born into. He clung to it with everything he had. The relentless climb. Hollywood opens the door, then slams it shut. When World War II erupted, Tony Curtis, still Bernard Schwartz, left behind the Bronx and enlisted in the U.S. Navy. He served aboard a submarine in the Pacific and stood on deck of the USS Proteus as Japan formally surrendered in Tokyo Bay. It was a moment that should have introduced freedom. But Tony returned home with something else, the realization that he wanted more than survival. He wanted a life bigger than anything he had ever known. Acting was the only dream he had, and it was fragile, uncertain, but intoxicating enough to push him across the country to Hollywood in 1948. He arrived with $20, one suitcase, and a belief that he was still the least likely man in any room to succeed. His birth name, Bernard Schwartz, marked him as too foreign, too ethnic, too difficult for studio executives who wanted marketable fantasies. Universal gave him one chance, but not without conditions. His name had to go. Overnight, he became Tony Curtis, a man who did not yet exist, but who he desperately needed to become. Hollywood did not welcome him with open arms. His first jobs paid only enough for pie and milk. His apartment had nothing but a mattress, and he was bullied, dismissed, and used. He once said, "They weren't exploiting my naivete. I handed it to them on a platter." He worked for $43 a week and still feared he would be sent back to the Bronx a failure, the fate he feared more than anything. There were moments he nearly quit. One day he stood in Union Station, ready to board a train back home. But a studio press agent found him just in time, urging him not to give up. That intervention changed Hollywood history, because soon after, something unexpected happened. Although Curtis had barely spoken a line in his early films, movie magazines began featuring his face. Fans, mostly young women, began sending letters by the thousands. Then came the night that changed everything, the premiere where Tony, still practically unknown, stepped onto the stage and the audience erupted, screaming, stomping, nearly rioting for a man the studio barely valued. Fame arrives, but so does the darkness he thought he escaped. Once Universal recognized Tony Curtis's potential, his ascent was rapid. In 1951, the prince who was a thief transformed him from a struggling newcomer into a bona fide box office favorite. Audiences adored him. His blue eyes, effortless charm, and athletic flair made him a fantasy figure in the post-war era. For the studio, he became a gold mine. For Tony, success was intoxicating but also terrifying, because deep down he still feared that everything could vanish as quickly as it appeared. Throughout the 1950s, Tony starred in a relentless string of films: Flesh and Fury, Houdini with Janet Leigh, The Vikings with Kirk Douglas, Sweet Smell of Success with Burt Lancaster, and the groundbreaking The Defiant Ones, which earned him an Academy Award nomination in 1958. He had officially joined the ranks of Hollywood's elite. Even Cary Grant praised him. But fame, for Tony, was never simply a reward. It was also a mask. Behind the scenes, Curtis struggled with the same insecurities that had shaped him since childhood. He adored Janet Leigh, whom he married in 1951, despite Universal's aggressive attempts to stop the union. The studio believed marriage would ruin his appeal to female audiences. They tried persuasion, pressure, and outright threats, even warning him they'd send him back to the Bronx. Tony and Janet eloped anyway, and for a time they became Hollywood's golden couple. But Tony's heart was a fragile place, shaped by trauma and distrust. As his fame grew, so did the emotional cracks. He admitted years later, "I wasn't enough for Janet." He became jealous, suspicious, and increasingly distant. Rumors swirled about flirtations and affairs, even with his teenage co-star Christine Kaufman. Whether true or not, the whispers eroded the marriage until it finally collapsed in 1962. And as his personal life fractured, something else crept into his world: the beginnings of addiction. Hollywood was a place where numbing agents were readily available, and many stars used them to survive the pressure. Tony, who had spent a lifetime trying to outrun pain, found temporary escape in alcohol, then later in cocaine. Fame had given him everything he ever wanted: attention, money, celebrity. But it also opened the door to self-destruction, addiction, scandal, and the collapse of a Hollywood golden boy. By the time the 1960s arrived, Tony Curtis was still working constantly, but something inside him had begun to unravel. His marriage to Janet Leigh had ended, and although he quickly remarried Christine Kaufman, only 18 at the time, the world saw this not as romance, but as a sign that Curtis was losing control of the life he had built. Hollywood's golden boy had stepped into a new phase where his charm no longer outweighed the haunting insecurities and emptiness that had shadowed him since childhood. His career began shifting as well. Audiences who once adored him in swashbuckling adventures and light comedies were growing older. Hollywood's taste was changing. Curtis tried desperately to adapt, turning toward dramatic roles. In 1968, he gave one of the most critically acclaimed performances of his career in The Boston Strangler, playing a serial killer with frightening precision. Critics praised him, but the success couldn't heal the damage happening behind closed doors. This was the decade when Tony's addictions tightened their grip. The drinking grew worse. Cocaine entered his life in the mid-1970s while filming Lepka, and it quickly became a destructive force. What began as a coping mechanism for stress spiraled into dependency. By the early 1980s, he was consuming drugs heavily, his once athletic body deteriorating, his energy fading. His third marriage fell apart. His career, once unstoppable, dwindled to low-budget projects and sporadic television appearances. The scandals surrounding him also began to accumulate. In 1970, Tony was arrested at London's Heathrow Airport for marijuana possession, a public humiliation that further damaged his reputation. Later in life, actress Kim Novak accused him of spiking her drink at a 1958 Beverly Hills party, leaving her disoriented and vulnerable. It was one of the earliest accusations of sexual misconduct by a major Golden Age actor. While Curtis never publicly addressed the allegation, it cast a dark shadow over his legacy. Yet perhaps the most devastating blow was not to his career, but to his role as a father. In 1994, his son Nicholas, born during his marriage to Leslie Allen, died of a heroin overdose at just 23. Tony later said it was the one pain he would never recover from. Court records revealed that the men who supplied the heroin were charged with manslaughter. Even so, the loss crushed him. His addictions worsened before he finally checked himself into the Betty Ford Center in 1982 and committed to sobriety. Reinvention, tragedy, and the final betrayal that shattered his family. After decades of chaos, Tony Curtis attempted something he had rarely done in his life. He tried to rebuild himself. In 1982, after the worst years of addiction, he entered the Betty Ford Clinic. Sobriety did not solve everything, but it gave him clarity for the first time in years. Curtis redirected his restless energy into painting, a passion rooted in childhood when rheumatic fever kept him bedridden and art was the only escape he had. His paintings, abstract, emotional, often chaotic, reflected the storms he had survived. Soon, galleries in New York and California showcased his work. One piece, The Red Table, was even displayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. For a moment, it seemed he had found peace in creation rather than destruction. But life was not finished testing him. The death of his son Nicholas in 1994 had already carved a wound that never fully closed. Curtis once said losing his child was the greatest sadness of my life, admitting that even all his career triumphs meant nothing compared to that grief. After Nicholas's death, Tony withdrew from public life, spending more time in Cape Cod with family. Though he continued acting occasionally, appearing in Some Like It Hot, the musical, and later his final film, David and Fatima, in 2008, his health steadily declined. By the 2000s, he lived with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a reminder of the years he spent smoking. In 2006, he nearly died from pneumonia and spent over a month in a coma. He survived, but the illness left him wheelchair-bound. Even so, Curtis kept painting, kept signing books, kept meeting fans. But privately, he knew time was running out. Then came the decision that would permanently fracture his family. Tony Curtis rewrote his will. 6 months before his death, he removed all 6 of his children, Jamie Lee, Kelly, Alexandra, Allegra, Nicholas, and Benjamin. He left everything, an estate worth around $60 million, to his 6th wife, Jill Vandenberg, who was 46 years younger than him. The will explicitly listed each child's name only to state they would receive nothing. When Tony died in 2010 at age 85 from cardiac arrest triggered by long-term lung disease, the shock of his death was soon eclipsed by the shock of what he left behind. His children were devastated, blindsided, and horrified. They believed he had been manipulated. Jill denied everything. Lawsuits followed. Accusations surfaced. Pain deepened. The secrets that emerged after his death, and the dark side no one wanted to believe. As the world mourned Tony Curtis in late 2010, tributes poured in from fans, actors, and institutions that had long honored his 6-decade career. Hollywood celebrated him as a master of reinvention, a heartthrob who became a serious actor, a comedian, a painter, a philanthropist. But death has a way of pulling back curtains, and the years that followed revealed layers of his life that contradicted the glossy image the public once adored. Not long after his passing, a wave of revelations and allegations began to reshape how people viewed the man behind the charm. In 2009, just a year before he died, Tony released The Making of Some Like It Hot, where he finally admitted he had a secret affair with Marilyn Monroe during the filming of the 1959 classic. For decades, he had alternated between denying and hinting, joking and deflecting. But in his book, he told the raw truth. The affair was real. Both were married, and Marilyn had miscarried his child. It was a confession that shocked fans who had believed the behind-the-scenes magic of Some Like It Hot was purely cinematic. Instead, the film's comedy had hidden a heartbreaking reality. But another revelation was darker. Actress Kim Novak came forward years after Curtis's death, claiming that in 1958, during a party at his Beverly Hills home, he had spiked her drink. She described waking up naked and confused, with no memory of what had happened. Although the accusation could never be legally resolved, it cast a troubling shadow over his reputation. For many, it was a reminder that Hollywood's golden age was not innocent, and that powerful men often hid behind their status and popularity. Then came the estate battle, which kept Tony's name in headlines long after the funeral. Jill Vandenberg, his last wife, not only inherited everything but also auctioned off hundreds of his personal belongings, including awards, scripts, paintings, and cherished mementos. The sale generated over $1 million. His children, stunned and deeply hurt, claimed they were never consulted and believed their father never intended his legacy to be scattered and sold. Allegra Curtis openly questioned whether Jill had manipulated him when he was vulnerable. Jamie Lee Curtis filed legal action alleging undue influence. Across interviews, court filings, and family disputes, one truth became painfully clear. The darkness Tony Curtis carried, born from childhood trauma, fueled by addiction, and complicated by fame, never fully left him. It simply shifted shapes. Tony Curtis spent his entire life trying to outrun the shadows that shaped him. But in the end, those shadows became part of the story the world could no longer ignore. His fame was real, his talent undeniable. Yet the pain he carried left marks deeper than anyone outside his family ever saw. What do you think was the biggest turning point in his troubled life? Share your thoughts below, and if you want more untold Hollywood stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next one.